Well, I'm very happy to be sitting here with Melissa Moye, who is the Director of Conservation Finance for the World Wildlife Fund. Melissa, I'm very curious. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about one of the initiatives that the World Wildlife Fund has, which is called their Debt for Development. What is that? How does that work?
Sure. I have to say that's the one cocktail party conversation that I never like to have because it's a rather complex mechanism. And funny enough, I actually got my start at WWF because I worked on debt for development swaps. And they grew out of the Latin American debt crisis in the late 80s, where there were swaps involving equity. So what happened was that the debt was discounted and then actually purchased in commercial secondary debt markets and used basically in exchange for equity in companies. So the concept involving development or debt for nature swaps, as we call them, involves basically swapping discounted debt, in other words, debt that's not worth as much as it was to begin with, in exchange for investments in development or nature. And most of the time, developing countries are interested in engaging in these sorts of swaps because it gives them the benefit of debt reduction, but also that they're investing in their own development or conservation goals.
Yeah, that sounds sort of like a win-win situation and a really great idea, and especially, of course, in the cases we're talking about today, which has to do with the environment and the work in the environment. Speaking of which, I understand you also have a role in Seapick. Could you tell us a little bit about this coalition?
Sure. We're very actively engaged in the Coalition for Private Investment in Conservation. And this is an initiative that was actually created at the World Conservation Congress and has only grown by leaps and bounds since it was created. Essentially, the goal of this coalition is to develop investment blueprints, which in fact would be oriented around investments that would show more or less market returns. And it's really an experiment because of the fact that in the past there has been a real dearth of so-called bankable projects. And so we actually have been working quite intensively through 5 different working groups around different sectors to develop the initiative. And we are really grateful to the Global Environment Facility, who's going to be financing investment capital along with the Rockefeller Foundation that will in fact help to jumpstart a set of investments.
And then a final question. I know you chaired one of the panels today. I just wanted to ask you a little bit how you felt about being at the symposium today and what you felt might be some of the highlights at today's symposium.
Sure. I think for me, coming from WWF, we play a certain role in this space, and we're very much focused around the impact metrics that everyone should be thinking about. But we also want to, in fact, see real growth in terms of particularly the private investment in this space. I think there's a lot of potential for blended capital, and we act as an agency for both the Green Climate Fund as well as the Global Environment Facility. And so to the extent that NGOs can work with both public and private capital institutions and many of our government and community partners, and of course the companies. I don't think we heard a lot today from the companies who very much depend on the supply chains in developing countries. And so I found that this was a fascinating opportunity to hear from a lot of different voices. And I think that our plenary closing panel epitomized that, and particularly hearing from Minister Pohl, the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources from El Salvador, where she spoke really from the heart about how this work on landscape restoration matters to people, particularly for an extremely vulnerable country like El Salvador, which is experiencing climate change and hurricanes, which just have devastated their economy.
Well, thank you very much for talking with us, Melissa. It's been very interesting, and we're really glad to get your feedback.